Welcome to Copilot Podcasts. A 44-page book about mice working in a fish warehouse somehow contains wages disputes, language politics, territorial annexation, taxation, and a centuries-old feud between cats and mice. That's not a children's story. That's a compressed portrait of how human societies actually function, and it fits in your back pocket. Today, we're breaking down The Grumbling Warehouse by Joseph Nabugwu, specifically what its characters represent, what themes Nabugwu is working with, and why this tiny fable carries a social critique that punches way above its weight. By the end of this episode, you'll be able to read this book as the layered allegory it is, not just a quirky animal story. I've got someone here who's gone deep on this text, and I want to start with the most basic question that actually isn't basic at all. What even is this book?
So, The Grumbling Warehouse is a short work of fiction, 44 pages, independently published on January 3rd, 2018, by Joseph Nabugwu. And the setup is deceptively simple. Different mice are employed to work in a fish warehouse set in Middle England. But the moment you look at how that warehouse is structured, you realize Nabugwu is doing something much more deliberate.
Right, because it's not just mice running around a warehouse. There's a whole hierarchy.
Exactly. According to the book's description on Amazon, the mice have 4 distinct formations: managers, principals, marshals, and stewards. And each group has very specific duties. The managers generate the work, the principals supervise, the stewards actually do the work, and the marshals control the security posts.
So you've got a full organizational chart in a mouse warehouse.
A full organizational chart, yes. And what's interesting is the qualifier Nabugwu adds, every mouse is qualified by being a mouse. So the hierarchy isn't based on some extraordinary individual merit. It's just the structure that exists, and you slot into it based on where you land.
That's already doing a lot of work as a metaphor. Like, the system precedes you.
Completely. And then you get to the stewards, who are the ones actually doing the physical labor, and they are the ones grumbling. According to the Amazon description, they grumble about their wages, the tedium of the work, the language spoken in the warehouse, and the attitudes of some of the principals.
Wait, the language spoken in the warehouse? That's a specific grievance. What's that about?
So this is one of the most pointed details in the whole book. The approved language for the warehouse is called kangles, and every mouse is supposed to understand and speak it. Now, Nabugwu doesn't spell out exactly what kangles represents, but the implication is pretty clear. There's an official language of the institution, and if you don't speak it fluently, you're already at a disadvantage before you've done a single day's work.
So language becomes a gatekeeping mechanism. It's not just about communication. It's about who belongs and who's marked as an outsider.
Exactly, and that's a very real dynamic in actual workplaces. The way you speak, the vocabulary you use, the accent you carry, these things get read as signals of competence or belonging, even when they have nothing to do with the actual work.
And the stewards are the ones feeling that most acutely because they're already at the bottom of the hierarchy.
Right. So you've got wages, tedium, language, and the attitudes of the principals all stacking up on the stewards at once. That's not one grievance, that's a system of grievances. And the title of the book is literally The Grumbling Warehouse. So Nabugwu is centering that discontent as the defining feature of the whole place.
I want to zoom out for a second because this book fits into a really long tradition of using animals to say things about human society that would be harder to say directly. Like, this isn't a new move.
Not at all. And it's worth naming that tradition because it actually helps you understand what Nabugwu is doing and why. The most obvious touchstone is George Orwell's Animal Farm, pigs running a farm as a critique of Soviet-style authoritarianism. But you can go much further back. Aesop's fables used animals to make moral points that were safer to make through a fox or a crow than through a named human being.
There's something about the animal frame that gives the writer and the reader a kind of plausible deniability. Like, it's just a story about mice.
Exactly. And a verified Amazon reviewer actually put it really well. They described the book as being buried in fictitious characters, names, places, and incidents. That word buried is doing a lot. The real content is underneath the animal surface, and you have to dig for it.
And there's actually a fascinating historical parallel here that I think is worth bringing in, because there's another famous grumbling text that used insects to critique society.
Oh, you mean Bernard Mandeville's The Grumbling Hive from 1705?
That's the one. Tell me about that, because the parallel is kind of wild.
So Mandeville's poem, which later became The Fable of the Bees, described a beehive that mirrors human society in almost every detail. The bees have lawyers, physicians, politicians, all of them operating with varying degrees of corruption. And the poem's argument, according to Wikipedia's entry on the Fable of the Bees, is that private vices actually create public benefits, that the greed and self-interest driving individuals is what makes the whole society function.
Which is a pretty provocative claim. And it got him in trouble, right?
Massively. According to the USU Digital Exhibits page on the Grumbling Hive, Mandeville's notoriety was guaranteed when a Middlesex grand jury presented his work for, quote, denigrating virtue and religion as harmful to society and recommending vices as beneficial to it. He was essentially put on trial for his ideas.
So the tradition of using animal or insect allegory to critique society has always carried some risk. Writers who do this are saying something they know is uncomfortable.
And Nabugwu is working in that same vein, even if the stakes are different. The Grumbling Warehouse isn't going to get anyone hauled before a grand jury, but the discomfort it's pointing at, workplace hierarchy, language exclusion, the gap between those who supervise and those who labor, that's very real and very current.
Let's get into the bigger picture of what the book is actually critiquing, because from what I understand, it goes well beyond just the warehouse itself.
Yeah, this is where the book gets genuinely ambitious for something so short. The Amazon description lays out a list of topics the story touches on as it progresses, and it's a lot. There's a mouse Olympic, the payment of taxes, the annexation of territories, a conflict between ants and termites, and then finally how the cats and mice settled their centuries of enmity.
Wait, centuries of enmity between cats and mice? That's not just a workplace story anymore.
Right, and that's the point. The warehouse is the starting point, but Nanabugwu uses it as a lens to look at the whole social, political, and economic life of the mice. The warehouse becomes a kind of microcosm. What happens inside it reflects what happens in the broader world outside it.
So the cats and mice aren't just predator and prey. They're stand-ins for groups with a long history of conflict who eventually have to figure out how to coexist.
That's how the book frames it. And the fact that they do settle their enmity is significant. Nanabugwu is described on Amazon as offering moral teachings about peacemaking and how to resolve conflicts. So there's an optimistic thread running through what could otherwise be a pretty bleak picture.
That's interesting because a lot of social allegories don't offer resolution. They just hold up the mirror and leave you with the discomfort.
Exactly. And Book Life, which is the publisher's weekly platform for indie authors, describes the book as being about human relations in workplaces, the classifications, the rules, the benefits, the promotions, and the diversities. That word diversities is doing something. It's not just about class or labor, it's about difference itself and how institutions manage or fail to manage it.
So the four formations, managers, principals, marshals, stewards, those aren't just job titles. They're a map of how difference gets organized and ranked.
Precisely. And the fact that the qualification for being in the warehouse is simply being a mouse, that's Nabugwu pointing out that the hierarchy isn't natural or inevitable, it's constructed. You're all the same species, you're all qualified by the same basic fact of existence, and yet the system slots you into very different positions with very different rewards.
That's a really sharp observation, because it strips away the usual justifications for hierarchy, like, you're not a manager because you're a different kind of creature, you're a manager because of where the system put you.
And the stewards feel that acutely. Their grumbling isn't irrational, it's a rational response to a system that asks them to do the most labor for the least reward, in a language that may not even be their own, under the supervision of principals whose attitudes they find difficult.
I want to come back to the language thing, because I think it's the most underrated detail in the whole book. The fact that Nanabugwu invented a name for the official language, Kangles, rather than just saying English or leaving it unnamed. Why does that matter?
Because naming it makes it visible as a construct. If the language were just the language, it would feel natural, inevitable, neutral. But Kangles is clearly an invented word. It signals that this official language is a choice, an imposition, something that was decided by someone with the power to decide. And that reframes the steward's grievance about it. They're not just struggling with communication, they're navigating a power structure that's been encoded into language itself.
That's a really layered move for a 44-page book.
It really is. And it's part of what makes the Amazon description's claim so interesting. It says the book can be read by any group as a fable, as a public sphere study, and as a digest of the problems employers and employees encounter. Those are three very different reading modes, and the book apparently sustains all three.
The public sphere framing is the one I find most interesting. Can you unpack that?
Sure. The Amazon description frames the warehouse as, quote, an example of a public sphere where different people come together for the sake of making a living and rendering services to their communities. So the warehouse isn't just a workplace, it's a space where society negotiates itself. Different groups with different interests, different languages, different positions in the hierarchy, all forced into proximity by economic necessity.
And the grumbling is what happens when that negotiation breaks down, or when one group feels like the terms of the negotiation were never fair to begin with.
Right. And what's striking is that the grumbling doesn't destroy the warehouse. The warehouse keeps functioning, the stewards keep working, the cats and mice eventually settle their enmity. The system persists even while people within it are deeply dissatisfied, which is, honestly, a pretty accurate description of how most institutions actually work.
That's almost more unsettling than if the warehouse collapsed. The grumbling is just absorbed.
And that's where the allegory gets really sharp. Because the question Nanabugu seems to be asking is, what does it take for a system to actually change, rather than just continuing to absorb the discontent of the people it's grinding down?
And the book doesn't necessarily answer that question directly.
Not directly, no. But the fact that the cats and mice do resolve their centuries of enmity suggests that Nanabugu believes resolution is possible. It just requires something more than grumbling. It requires actual negotiation, actual change in the relationship between groups.
Let me ask you something that might be a bit of a pushback. Is there a risk that the animal allegory actually softens the critique? Like, because it's mice and cats, does it let readers off the hook? They can enjoy the fable without really sitting with the discomfort?
That's a fair challenge, and it's one that gets leveled at the whole genre. But I think the counter-argument is that the animal frame actually does the opposite for a lot of readers. It lowers the defensive walls. When you're reading about mice grumbling about their wages, you're not immediately thinking about your own workplace politics or your own position in a hierarchy. And then, gradually, you are. The allegory sneaks past your defenses.
So the distance is actually a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. And the Amazon reviewer who described the book as buried in fictitious characters, names, places, and incidents, that's not a criticism. That's a description of how the allegory works. The burial is intentional. You have to do the work of excavating the real meaning.
I want to bring in the ants and termites conflict, because that one feels like it's operating on a different level than the warehouse hierarchy. What do you make of it?
So, the conflict between the ants and termites is mentioned in the Amazon description as one of the social and political elements the story touches on as it expands beyond the warehouse. And what's interesting is that ants and termites are both colony insects, both highly organized, both operating within rigid social structures. So their conflict isn't between order and chaos. It's between two different orders, two different systems, each convinced of its own legitimacy.
Which maps onto a lot of real-world conflicts, not between civilization and barbarism, but between two civilizations that can't agree on whose rules apply.
Precisely. And the annexation of territories that's also mentioned, that's geopolitical language dropped into a fable about mice. Nanabugu is deliberately reaching for the vocabulary of international relations and applying it to this animal world, which makes the allegory feel much bigger than just a workplace story.
So by the time you've got wages, language politics, territorial annexation, interspecies conflict, and a mouse Olympic, which I have to ask about, what is the mouse Olympic? The Amazon description mentions it as one of the social elements the story touches on, but doesn't elaborate. What it signals, though, is that Nanabugu is building a complete society, not just a workplace. The mice have their own version of international sporting competition, which implies diplomacy, national identity, the whole apparatus of how societies present themselves to each other. It's a detail that says, this world has depth. And all of that in 44 pages. That's genuinely impressive compression.
It is, and I think that compression is itself a statement. Nanabugu isn't writing a sprawling epic. He's saying that these dynamics, the hierarchy, the language politics, the territorial conflicts, the intergroup enmities, they don't need thousands of pages to feel real and recognizable. They're present in miniature everywhere you look.
So when you step back from everything we've covered, the four formations, the Kangol's language, the stewards grumbling, the cats and mice settling their enmity, the ants and termites conflict, what's the through line? What is Nabagwu actually arguing?
Here's what I think this really comes down to. The Grumbling Warehouse is making an argument that the problems we experience in workplaces, the hierarchies, the language barriers, the wage disputes, the sense that the rules were written by and for someone else, are not isolated workplace problems. They're symptoms of how societies organize themselves at every level. The warehouse is just the place where all of those forces become impossible to ignore because you're stuck in it 8 hours a day.
And the grumbling is the sound of people recognizing that gap between what the system promises and what it actually delivers.
Exactly. And Book Life's description frames it as being about the classifications, the rules, the benefits, the promotions, and the diversities, all the mechanisms by which institutions sort people and assign them value. The grumbling is what happens when people on the lower end of that sorting start to see the mechanism clearly.
And yet the book doesn't end in collapse or revolution. The cats and mice find peace. The warehouse presumably keeps running.
Which is where the moral teaching about peacemaking comes in. Ninabugwu seems to be saying that the answer isn't necessarily to tear the system down, it's to actually negotiate, to find a way for groups with centuries of enmity to coexist. That's a more complicated and honestly more demanding conclusion than just burn it all down.
It asks more of everyone involved.
It does, and I think that's what makes this book worth taking seriously despite its modest size and its indie publishing origins. It's not trying to be Animal Farm, it's doing something more intimate. It's saying, here is the world you already live in, rendered in miniature, and here is what it might look like to actually work through it rather than just endure it.
That's a really good place to land. And it makes me think about what it means that this book is independently published. Like, it didn't go through a major publishing house. It came directly from the author to the reader.
And there's something fitting about that, given what the book is about. A story about people navigating institutional structures published outside of institutional structures. The medium and the message are in conversation with each other.
Okay, so here's what I want listeners to take away from this. The Grumbling Warehouse is a 44-page fable about mice in a fish warehouse in Middle England. And that description is both completely accurate and almost entirely misleading. What it's actually doing is mapping the full complexity of how societies organize labor, language, hierarchy, and conflict onto a world small enough to hold in your hands.
And the 4 formations, managers, principals, marshals, stewards, give you a framework for thinking about how institutions sort people and what that sorting costs the people at the bottom. The Kangol's language detail gives you a way to think about how power gets encoded into something as seemingly neutral as communication. And the resolution between the cats and mice gives you something to hold on to. The idea that even centuries of enmity can be negotiated.
And the grumbling itself, that's not just background noise, that's the whole point. The stewards grumbling about wages, tedium, language, and the attitudes of the principals, that grumbling is the sound of people who can see the system clearly enough to be frustrated by it.
Which is actually the first step toward anything changing. You can't negotiate what you can't name. And the stewards are naming it loudly, even if the warehouse keeps running around them.
So the next time someone at work is grumbling about the rules, the language, the hierarchy, the gap between what they do and what they're rewarded for, maybe that's not just complaining. Maybe that's exactly what Nenabugwu's stewards are doing, holding up a mirror to the whole system and refusing to pretend it's invisible. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. The warehouse is always grumbling. The question is whether anyone's listening.